Today was a critical day at the United Nations General Assembly. The UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. 93 nations voted in favor of the resolution, 24 voted against, 58 countries abstained at the UNGA. This makes Russia only the second member to be suspended after Libya. The move was first initiated by the United States, and this was in response to the mass killings in Bucha. Now, before the vote, the Human Rights Council consisted of 47 member states. They were elected directly and individually by a secret ballot. This is done by a majority of the members of the General Assembly, but all eyes during the vote were on India. Today marked India's toughest test in the conflict. India abstained from voting on the resolution. New Delhi said that the country was on the side of peace, adding that no solution can come at the cost of innocent lives. So far, India has abstained on at least 10 resolutions at the UN Security Council and at the UN General Assembly, at the Human Rights Council and at the International Atomic Energy Agency. New Delhi also condemned the killings in Bucha, calling for an independent probe. Listen in to the Indian representative's statement on the abstention.
Humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential.
I think
General Assembly today. We do so for reasons of both substance and process. Since the inception of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue and diplomacy. We remain firm.
Now, for more perspective, joining us at this hour to discuss the ramifications of this decision, our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibal, who joins us from New Delhi, and our correspondent in New York, Susan Tehrani. Welcome both of you to WION. Siddhant, I want to take my first question from you. As we know, India has abstained. We know that New Delhi has maintained its neutral stance in this war. Russia has set an ultimatum earlier that even an abstention would be treated as an unfriendly gesture. Tell us more what this means.
Well, India, in its vote of explanation, pointed out the reason behind it. First, of course, talking about the substance and then, of course, the procedure. Now, if you look at what India has been doing since, of course, the Ukraine issue came at the UNSC or UNGA in the month of January, India has been abstaining. So India's official policy is whatever comes, whoever proposes it, whether it's the West, whether it's Russia, India is going to abstain, and that was the case. But what India, in its vote of explanation, pointed out was, first, of course, the Bucha killings, something that India has condemned at the United Nations Security Council and the Indian External Affairs Minister in the Indian Parliament. And secondly, that the due process wasn't followed. That is significant. There was, of course, no explanation on the uses of this word, but it looks like since the resolution was essentially thrusted by the West, that was one of the reasons. That is why one of the reasons was that India abstained.
Thanks, Siddhant, for those inputs. Now let's go to New York. Susan Tehrani joins us from New York at this hour. Susan, the UN has now suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. Tell us more about what this means and what will be the consequences of the same for Russia.
Right after this vote, Olaf Scholz, the EU representative to the United Nations, came at the stakeout and spoke to the media. He said that this meant an overwhelming support for the suspension of Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which sets the precedent, really, and something that has not been done before. And really, the ramifications right now is that because resolutions at the Human Rights Council are non-binding, but on the other hand, the Human Rights Council can provide recommendations on who can be charged and investigated for war crimes, then Russia not being on that panel can have ramifications for a country like Russia, who has been booted out. The question now is, how will this pan out, considering the fact that Russia continues to be a member of the United Nations Security Council, a permanent member, a veto-wielding power, if you may. But nonetheless, the West and the United States, which spearheaded this vote, sees this as a confidence-building measure, a day that human rights really prevailed over the actions of what it calls Russian aggression and even war crimes in Bucha. And also a draft resolution really said that it was grave concerns, gross and systematic violations of abuses of human rights, and that was the reason why it put this draft to the vote. vote. And we also heard from the UN director of the Human Rights Watch in a statement says that Russia's suspension, quote, sends a crystal clear message that they have no business on the council. So you see that it's getting support on that front as well.
Right, Susan, but I think the big question is, will this in any way deter Russia from its actions in Ukraine? We saw the blowback of Western sanctions across the world. Energy prices have soared. Will this recent move now spark a Russian retaliation?
Right, considering the fact that, again, when Olaf Scholz came and spoke to members of the media, he said that he was actually surprised how many countries voted in favor of this resolution, considering the fact that Russia was on an all-out campaign to really sway member states here at the United Nations to either to basically vote no, to say that Russia must stay on the Human Rights Council. In Russia's eyes, an abstention or a yes were both the same thing. So there was, something that even the Europeans and the United States were shocked that perhaps there was such an overwhelming support. And then you had that sort of verbal threat or somewhat in a written statement that was circulated among some member states on the part of Russia on the eve of this vote, saying that either you're with us or against us. So we'll have to see whether or not it'll have economic ramifications in terms of bilateral ties between Russia and some countries who abstained or voted yes on this resolution. But ultimately, whether or not it'll deter Russia from further actions in Ukraine, I mean, what resolution here at the United Nations has really done that? That's the million-dollar question. And on the other hand, Russia seems to be at a disadvantage point right now. It needs all the friends that it can have. So that's something to take into consideration as well.
Right. Susan, thanks so much for joining us with all those inputs. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.